Chapter 1. A Mother's Hands. The first thing anyone noticed about Mary Evans was her hands. They were not the delicate hands of women in glossy magazines. They were not adorned with polished nails or soft perfumes. Mary's hands were rough, calloused, and often cracked from years of scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and carrying heavy loads. Yet, to her son John, they were the safest place in the world. Those hands wiped his tears when he scraped his knee. They tucked him into bed on stormy nights. They worked late into the evening, holding needles and thread as she mended his worn-out clothes by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Mary had not always imagined this life. As a young woman, she once dreamed of traveling, of painting landscapes, of writing stories, but dreams had a way of fading when survival took their place. Her husband, Robert Evans, worked at the steel factory in town. Together, they made do with their modest home and their simple joys, shared meals, laughter over broken radios, whispered plans for the future. But life proved cruelly unpredictable. When John was only 8, an accident at the factory stole Robert away. Mary remembered the day vividly, the knock on the door, the solemn faces of Robert's co-workers, the words she could barely process. A collapsed beam. No chance of survival. Her world shattered in that instant. She could have collapsed too, sunk into grief, but when she saw John's frightened little face staring up at her, she knew she had no choice. She had to become both mother and father. From that day onward, Mary's hands worked endlessly. She took a morning job at the local bakery, kneading dough before the sun rose. In the evenings, she scrubbed offices in the city, the smell of disinfectant clinging to her clothes. Some nights, she came home so tired she could barely lift her arms, yet she still managed to cook a simple meal for John, still managed to kiss his forehead as he drifted to sleep. There were sacrifices, many of them. She sold her wedding ring to pay for John's school books. She gave up meals so he could eat enough. When winter came and the house grew icy, she patched his blanket with scraps of old fabric, wrapping him tight while she herself shivered through the night. But Mary never complained. She hid her exhaustion behind a smile, and she carried her burden silently. To John, she was a mountain, unyielding, strong, indestructible, and John adored her. "Don't worry, Mom," he often said, his small voice full of conviction. "When I grow up, I'll buy you a big house. You won't have to work anymore. You'll be a queen." Those words became Mary's secret treasure. She held on to them in her loneliest hours, imagining a future where her boy, successful and kind, would finally give her the rest she longed for. As John grew older, his brilliance shone through. He was sharp in his studies, quick with numbers, always curious about the world. Mary, though bone-tired, always made time to help him with homework, reading aloud from his textbooks until her throat grew sore. When his shoes tore at the seams, she patched them carefully, whispering prayers that he might walk a better path than hers. When John entered high school, Mary worked extra shifts to afford his uniforms and fees. She often returned home after midnight, her back aching, her hands blistered, but she felt a rush of pride every time she saw him studying by the lamp, his brow furrowed with determination. "You're going to be someone important one day," she told him. "Someone who changes lives." John would smile shyly. "And you'll live with me in a big house, Mom. Remember?" Mary would laugh softly, hiding the tears in her eyes. She wanted to believe in that dream. She wanted to believe that all the pain, all the hunger, all the loneliness she endured was building towards that future. At times, though, doubt crept in. Alone at night, when John was asleep, she would sit at the edge of her bed, rubbing her aching wrists, wondering how long her body could keep this up. The world was not kind to single mothers, and hers felt especially harsh. But every time despair threatened to swallow her, she reminded herself of those little hands that clutched hers so tightly, those innocent eyes that looked to her for everything. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to John. And so Mary carried on, day after day, year after year, her hands growing rougher, her body growing weaker, but her love burning ever brighter. For in those hands, scarred and tired as they were, lived the story of sacrifice, the kind only a mother could give. Time has a way of slipping quietly through the cracks of life, carrying away moments so subtly that one doesn't realize what has been lost until it is too late. For Mary Evans, the years passed both slowly and swiftly, slow in her body's weariness, yet swift in watching her son John grow into a man. By the time John graduated from university, Mary was in her late 50s. Her hair, once a rich brown, had turned silver, and the lines on her face deepened like etchings carved by the storms of time. Yet the pride in her eyes shone brighter than ever. On the day of his graduation, she clapped so hard her palms ached. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched John walk across the stage in his cap and gown, tall and confident, his name echoing through the auditorium. She whispered under her breath, "That's my boy. That's my John." When he spotted her in the crowd, he waved, smiling proudly. Mary's heart swelled. For all the years of hunger, sleepless nights, and aching bones, this moment felt like victory. Her boy had made it. A new beginning. For him, not long after, John landed a job at a corporate firm in the city. It wasn't long before he met Susan, a woman with sharp features, polished manners, and a certain ambition in her eyes. Susan came from a comfortable family and carried herself with confidence. She was polite to Mary, yes, but there was always a distance in her tone, as though she were addressing a stranger, not the mother of the man she loved. The wedding was beautiful. Mary sat near the front, her heart swelling with both joy and unease. She had always dreamed of seeing John happily married, yet she couldn't ignore the subtle coldness in Susan's smile whenever their eyes met. After the wedding, John and Susan moved into a modern apartment downtown. Mary still lived in her little house on the edge of town, the same one she had struggled to maintain all her life. At first, John called often. He visited on weekends, bringing groceries and sometimes slipping her extra cash. Mary would cook his favorite meals: roast chicken, apple pie, warm bread fresh from the oven. They would sit at the table laughing as though nothing had changed. But gradually, things began to shift. The space between it started small, missed visits here and there, phone calls cut short because John was too busy. He still came around, but less frequently. When he did, Susan often stayed behind, claiming she had errands. Mary noticed the subtle tension. She wasn't blind. When she did visit their apartment, she could see Susan's polite but distant demeanor, the way she tidied things up quickly after Mary sat on the sofa, as though uncomfortable with her presence. One evening, Mary overheard Susan in the kitchen, her voice hushed but sharp. "John, I know she's your mother, but she can't keep coming here every weekend. We need our own space. We're newly married. It's time we focus on us." John didn't argue. He simply said, "You're right." Those words, though not meant for her ears, pierced Mary's heart like a blade. She quietly left early that night, telling them she was tired. As she walked home, the streets blurred through her tears. From then on, she visited less. She told herself it was natural. Children grew, built families of their own, and moved on. But deep down, the emptiness gnawed at her. A mother's longing. Back in her quiet house, Mary's days stretched endlessly. She spent her mornings in the garden, tending to the roses she had once planted with Robert. Afternoons, she sat by the window with her knitting needles, though the sweaters piled up unused. Sometimes she baked, filling the kitchen with the smell of bread, only to realize there was no one to share it with. She waited for John's calls. Sometimes they came. Often, they didn't. When he did call, it was quick. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" "I'm in a meeting. Can't talk long. Love you. Bye." She clung to those brief words like lifelines. Mary never complained. She never said, "I miss you," or "You're drifting away." Instead, she always said, "I'm fine, John. Just take care of yourself. Don't worry about me." But after she hung up, she sat in silence, her hands resting on her lap, the house too large and too empty around her. She remembered the promises he once made as a boy. "I'll buy you a big house. You'll be a queen." Now, in her twilight years, she lived alone in her crumbling little house, with no one to share her meals or her stories. The pain of distance. Years passed, and the distance grew. John was thriving in his career, climbing the corporate ladder. He and Susan traveled often, attending parties, building connections. They had a son of their own, little Michael. Mary adored her grandson. Every time she saw him, she felt a new surge of life. She tried to visit, bringing him toys she could barely afford, knitting him tiny sweaters. But the visits became fewer and fewer. Susan always had an excuse. Michael was busy, the house was messy, they were traveling. Mary smiled through it all. She told herself she didn't want to intrude, but in her heart, she felt like a guest in her own son's life. The boy who had once clutched her hands, promising her the world, now belonged to another world entirely, one where she no longer seemed to fit. And though she never said it aloud, the silence of her home echoed the truth. The drift between mother and son had become an ocean. John sat in silence, guilt gnawing at him. He remembered her sacrifices, her hands washing his clothes, her laughter at his graduation, her promises that everything would be all right. And now he was faced with a choice that felt both logical and heartless. When he told Mary, she didn't protest. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening. "If you think that's best, John," she said softly. But when he left that night, she sat alone on her bed, pressing her trembling hands together, whispering a prayer no one would hear. A mother's heart. The day she entered the old age home, Mary carried only a small suitcase, some clothes, a Bible, a framed picture of John as a boy, and one of little Michael. She smiled as John helped her inside, telling him not to worry, telling him she would be fine. She even waved cheerfully as he left. But when the door closed, her smile broke. The walls smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. Strangers shuffled down the hallways. The bed felt too neat, too cold. Mary sat on it, clutching the photo of John, whispering softly to herself. "It's all right. He has his life now. This is better for him." And though her heart shattered into pieces, she told herself, as she had all her life, that her suffering was worth it, so long as John was safe, happy, and free. It began quietly, like a shadow slipping across the floor. At first, Mary Evans thought it was nothing more than age catching up with her. She was in her 60s now, her joints stiff, her steps slower than before. She grew tired more easily. Sometimes, while knitting or hanging clothes, she would pause to catch her breath, pressing a hand against her chest. But then, the fatigue deepened. Some mornings, she could barely rise from bed. Her appetite waned. A dull ache pulsed in her bones, and her once bright eyes grew dim. She brushed it off for months, telling herself it was just getting old. After all, wasn't this what happened to everyone? One autumn afternoon, however, the pain became unbearable. She was folding laundry when a sharp stabbing seized her chest, radiating into her back. She fell into a chair, gasping for air, her vision swimming. For the first time, real fear gripped her. Her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, noticed her distress and insisted on calling a doctor. The examination was long, the tests many. Mary sat in the sterile hospital room, her wrinkled hands trembling in her lap, her heart hammering with dread. The doctor finally returned, his face heavy with the kind of expression she had seen once before, on the day she lost her husband. "Mrs. Evans," he said gently, "I'm afraid the results confirm what we suspected. It's cancer. Advanced stage." The words dropped into the room like stones into water, rippling through her mind until everything else blurred. Cancer. She heard nothing else for a long moment, only the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. The burden of silence. Mary left the hospital with a folder of instructions, appointments, and pamphlets about treatments, but her mind clung only to one thought. I must not burden John. She remembered how hard he worked, how busy his life was. She pictured Susan's pursed lips, her subtle sighs whenever Mary called or visited. She imagined the stress of raising Michael, the endless meetings, the constant rush. No, she couldn't place this weight on their shoulders. She had carried burdens all her life. Surely she could carry this one too. So she said nothing. She went about her days as usual, watering her plants, baking bread, knitting small gifts for Michael. When John called, she forced cheer into her voice. "I'm fine, son. Just a little tired, that's all. You make sure you eat properly. Don't skip meals. John, always in a hurry, never suspected otherwise. Cracks in the mask. But illness has a way of stripping away pretense. Her weight dropped quickly. Her skin turned pale, almost translucent. The vibrant energy that once lit her smile dimmed. Even her hands, the hands that had worked tirelessly all her life, began to tremble uncontrollably. When John finally visited one weekend, he noticed. "Mom, you don't look well," he said, frowning. "You've lost weight. Are you eating properly?" Mary forced a smile. "Oh, you know me." "I've just been dieting a little," but John's eyes narrowed. For once, he wasn't rushing to his phone or the door. "Mom, be honest." "What's wrong?" Mary hesitated, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to protect him, to hide her suffering as she always had. But another part of her, weak, weary, frightened, longed to confess. Finally, she whispered, "The doctor says it's cancer, John. Advanced. I didn't want to worry you." Silence filled the room. John's face drained of color. He sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "Cancer? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to trouble you, son," she said softly. "You have your work, your family. I didn't want to be a burden." A decision made. In the weeks that followed, John wrestled with what to do. He visited the hospital with her, spoke with doctors, looked into treatment plans. But every conversation circled back to one harsh reality. She would need round-the-clock care. At home one evening, Susan voiced what had already been echoing in his mind. "John, your mother is sick. She needs constant attention. We can't handle that here. We have work, Michael's school, our lives. You know we can't do this ourselves." John frowned. "She's my mother. She raised me alone. I can't just—" Susan cut in, her tone sharp but practical. "You're not abandoning her. There are excellent facilities, old-age homes with trained nurses and doctors. She'll get professional care. It's the best thing for her. For us, too." The Oakwood Senior Residence was not an unkind place. The walls were freshly painted, the floors polished, the rooms neat and orderly. Nurses in pale blue uniforms walked briskly through the corridors, their shoes clicking softly against the linoleum. There was always the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the scent of overcooked vegetables drifting from the dining hall. To an outsider, it might have seemed comfortable, even pleasant. But to Mary Evans, it felt like another world. She had lived her whole life in a warm, cluttered home filled with laughter, pots simmering on the stove, and the rustle of John's footsteps running down the hallway. Here, everything felt sterile, muted, and cold. Her new room was small, just enough for a bed, a nightstand, and a narrow wardrobe. A window overlooked the garden, where a few tired flowers struggled to bloom. On the wall above her bed, she hung the framed photo of John as a little boy, his toothy grin frozen in time. Beside it, she placed Michael's picture, his innocent eyes a reminder of the next generation. That was all she carried of her life before. 2 photographs and a heart full of memories. The other residents. The home was filled with people who, like Mary, had stories behind their wrinkles. There was Mr. Harris, who once taught literature at the local high school, but now spent his days staring out of the window, reciting fragments of Shakespeare to no one in particular. Mrs. Green, a lively woman with snowy hair, still wore bright lipstick and pearls every morning, insisting on dignity, even in her twilight years. She liked to play piano in the common room, her fingers trembling, but her spirit unshaken. And then there was old Mr. Patterson, whose booming laughter hid the ache of being forgotten by his 3 children. He liked to tell everyone that he once owned a fleet of fishing boats, though no one knew if the story was true. Mary listened to their tales, their jokes, their complaints. She smiled when they smiled, laughed when they laughed. But inside, she felt apart. She carried her cancer silently, like a shadow that no one else could see. A quiet routine. Life in Oakwood followed a clockwork rhythm. At 7 a.m., the nurses woke the residents, serving tea or coffee in small cups. By 8 o'clock, everyone gathered in the dining hall for breakfast. Toast, porridge, sometimes scrambled eggs if the kitchen felt generous. Mornings were filled with small activities, knitting circles, reading hours, or gentle exercises in the garden. Afternoons meant rest or television in the common lounge. Evenings brought dinner at 6 o'clock sharp, followed by silence in the hallways as one by one the doors closed. Mary slipped into this routine quietly. She did not complain, nor did she demand much. She carried her knitting basket with her, working on tiny scarves and mittens she had no one to give to. She read her Bible softly at night, her lips moving in whispered prayers. Yet every evening, when the halls grew still, she sat by her window, clutching John's childhood photo, and waited for his visits. Visits from John. At first, John came often. Every Sunday, he appeared at Oakwood, dressed neatly in his office shirt, Susan and Michael sometimes in tow. He brought flowers, or sometimes her favorite lemon cookies from the bakery she loved. He asked how she was feeling, if the nurses were treating her well, if she needed anything. Mary always smiled, answering, "I'm fine, dear. Don't you worry about me. Just seeing you makes me happy," and she meant it. Every moment with him was a treasure. But as months passed, the visits grew shorter, then fewer. Work demanded his time. Michael had school projects, sports events, birthday parties. Susan often excused herself, saying, "We'll come next week." Next week became next month. And slowly, Mary learned to mask the sting of disappointment. Each time John called to say he couldn't make it, she replied cheerfully, "That's all right, son. I understand. You take care of yourself. I'll be fine here." But when she hung up, she would sit in silence, her hands trembling, her chest aching, not just from the cancer, but from the hollow ache of being forgotten. Bonds in the shadows. In time, Mary grew close to some of the other residents. Mrs. Green often pulled her into the common room when she played piano. "Come, Mary," she'd say, her lipstick glowing even under the dim lights. "Sing with me." "I know you must have a lovely voice," Mary laughed softly. "Oh no, my dear. My singing days are long gone." But once, when Mrs. Green began playing Amazing Grace, Mary's lips moved, and a fragile melody escaped her throat. Other residents joined in, their voices cracked but heartfelt. For a few moments, the hall was filled not with loneliness, but with harmony. Mr. Harris sometimes recited poetry to her. "Listen, Mrs. Evans," he would say, his voice trembling. "Shakespeare once wrote, 'How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child.'" Mary smiled sadly, understanding too well the weight of those words. Nights of reflection. The nights were the hardest. When the lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, Mary lay awake, her thoughts swirling. She thought of John as a boy, his laughter, his tears, his first day at school. She remembered staying up late to sew his clothes, skipping meals so he could eat, working long hours at the diner so he could go to college. And now, here she was, alone in a quiet room, her body weakening, her son too busy to see her. She did not resent him, not truly. A mother's heart rarely holds resentment. Instead, she whispered prayers for him, for Susan, for little Michael. "Lord, keep them safe. Give John strength. Give Michael kindness. Don't let him forget the value of love." Then, with tears sliding down her cheeks, she would clutch John's childhood photo and whisper, "I did my best, didn't I?" And somewhere deep inside, a small voice, her own, answered back, "Yes, you did." This was life in the home, days of quiet routine, small moments of joy, and long nights of aching solitude. And as the cancer spread silently through her body, Mary knew her days were numbered. But still, she carried herself with dignity, with grace, with the love of a mother who never stopped forgiving. The seasons changed outside the windows of Oakwood. Leaves turned from green to gold, then fell, leaving the trees bare against the gray sky. Snow covered the garden in soft silence, then melted into spring's fragile blossoms. For Mary Evans, the passage of time was marked not by calendars or clocks, but by the rhythm of her weakening body. The cancer, once a whisper, grew louder each day. The body, betrays it, began with fatigue so heavy she could barely rise from bed. Her hands trembled too much to knit, her eyes too dim to read for long. Soon, the pain arrived. Sharp stabs in her bones, a constant ache in her chest, a burning weakness that drained her strength. The nurses noticed. They increased her medication, adjusted her diet, and offered her comfort as best they could. But no medicine could erase the truth. Mary was fading. One afternoon, as she tried to stand from her chair, her legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the floor with a cry, her frail body crumpling like paper. A nurse rushed in, helped her up, and placed her gently back in bed. Mary smiled weakly. I suppose I'm not as strong as I thought. But inside, she knew. Her time was slipping away. Fewer visits. By now, John's visits had become rare, separated by weeks instead of days. When he did come, it was often hurried, squeezed between meetings or on his way to drop Michael at practice. "Mom, how are you feeling?" he asked one afternoon, his phone buzzing in his pocket. Mary smiled, pale and thin beneath the blankets. "Oh, I'm all right, dear. Just a little tired." "You're in good hands here," John said, glancing at his watch. "The nurses know what they're doing." She reached out, her trembling hand brushing his sleeve. "I know, son. Don't worry about me. You mustn't overwork yourself." But when he left, Mary lay back, staring at the ceiling, her heart aching with the unspoken words. "I just wanted more time with you." The pain of being forgotten. There were days when John didn't call at all. Susan never came anymore, always too busy with work or Michael's activities. Mary learned to pretend she didn't mind. She listened when Mr. Harris recited poetry, smiled when Mrs. Green played piano, and laughed at Mr. Patterson's tall tales. But when the evenings grew quiet, she sat by her window, whispering to the night. "John, do you remember the nights I stayed up with you when you were sick? Do you remember how I carried you on my back when you were too tired to walk? Do you remember, son?" Her voice cracked, and tears slid down her face, but no one was there to answer. A nurse's kindness. Among the staff was a young nurse named Emily. She had kind eyes and a gentle touch, and she often lingered by Mary's bedside longer than required. "Mrs. Evans, are you in pain?" she asked softly one evening. "A little," Mary admitted, "but it's not the worst pain. The hardest part is—" She paused, swallowing her words. "The loneliness?" Emily guessed. Mary nodded, tears brimming. "I know my son loves me. He's just busy. I don't blame him. I never will. But sometimes I wish—" Her voice faltered. "I wish I could see him like before. Just sit with him. Talk. Like we used to." Emily squeezed her hand. "You're not forgotten, Mary. Not by me. Not by God." The words comforted her, but they could not erase the hollow space in her heart where John's presence should have been. A son's excuses. Meanwhile, John was drowning in his own responsibilities. Work deadlines piled up, Susan pressed him about finances, and Michael demanded his attention for school and sports. Each time he thought about visiting his mother, something else got in the way. "She's being taken care of," he told himself. "The nurses know what to do. She understands. She's strong." But late at night, when the house grew quiet, guilt pricked at him. He would see her face in his mind, frail, smiling, forgiving. He remembered her laughter, her sacrifices, the way she held his hand when he was small. Still, he pushed the thoughts aside, promising himself he'd make time, next week. The near goodbye one winter night, Mary's pain became unbearable. She clutched her chest, gasping for air, her frail body shaking. Nurses rushed in, calling for the doctor on duty. Emily stayed by her side, holding her hand. "Stay with me, Mary. Breathe. You're not alone in that moment," Mary whispered weakly. "Tell John. Tell him I love him." Always. Her eyes fluttered shut, and for a terrifying moment it seemed she was gone. But after hours of care, she stabilized, slipping into uneasy sleep. The next morning, John received a call from Oakwood. "Your mother had a very rough night," the doctor told him. She's stable now, but her condition is worsening. You should come soon. John sat frozen at his desk, his chest tightening. For the first time, he truly saw the truth he had been avoiding. His mother was dying, and he hadn't been there. A crack in the heart. That night, John lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Susan slept beside him, Michael's laughter faint in his memory from earlier that day. But all he could hear was his mother's voice, echoing in his mind. "Don't worry about me, son. Just seeing you makes me happy." The words were filled with love, but now they pierced him like knives. He realized with a deep, painful clarity that he had taken her for granted. She had given her whole life for him, and he had repaid her with distance, excuses, and neglect. And though he didn't know it yet, life had a way of repeating its lessons. One day, he too would be old, frail, and waiting for a visit that might never come. For the first time in years, John wept. The days grew shorter for Mary Evans. Time, once marked by seasons, now seemed to shrink into hours, into moments. Her body weakened so greatly that even lifting a teacup became a battle. Her once bright eyes now appeared glassy, her breath shallow, her voice a faint whisper. The cancer had spread. The doctors said there was little more they could do. Pain management, comfort care. Waiting. Mary understood. She had seen death before, when her husband passed, when neighbors and friends faded one by one. But facing it herself was different. Not frightening, exactly, but heavy. Heavy with the weight of unfinished conversations, with the love she longed to pour out just once more into her son's life. The doctor's words. One cold morning, John received another call. This time, it wasn't just a warning. "Mr. Evans," the doctor said, his tone careful, "your mother's condition has worsened. She may not have much time left. If you want to say goodbye, you should come soon." The words hit John like a blow. He sank into his office chair, his head in his hands. For months, he had avoided this reality. For months, he had told himself there would be more time. Next week, next visit, next call. But now, there was no next. Only now. He drove to Oakwood that very evening, Susan beside him, Michael silent in the back seat. The car ride was thick with tension, the air filled with things unsaid. John's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A mother's smile. When John entered his mother's room, his heart broke. Mary lay in bed, frail and pale, her breathing shallow. Her hands, once strong, once busy with work, cooking, knitting, now rested weakly on the blanket, trembling even at rest. Yet when she saw him, her lips curved into a faint smile. "John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." John dropped into the chair beside her, tears already filling his eyes. He took her hand gently, shocked by how light and fragile it felt. "Of course I came, Mom. I should have been here more. I'm so sorry." Mary shook her head slowly. "No, son. Don't apologize. You have your life. You've done well. That's all I ever wanted." Her forgiveness cut him deeper than blame ever could. The conversation that never was for hours. John sat beside her, holding her hand, telling her stories of work, of Michael, of little things she had missed. Susan stood quietly at the back of the room, and Michael, shy and uncertain, hovered near the door. Mary's eyes lit up faintly at the sight of her grandson. "Michael," she whispered, beckoning him closer. "Come here, my boy." He stepped forward, awkward but obedient, and she touched his cheek with trembling fingers. "Be kind, child. Always be kind, to your parents, to everyone. Kindness is what matters most." Michael nodded silently, the weight of her words pressing into his young heart. As the evening darkened, Mary's energy waned. Her voice grew fainter, her eyes heavier. Yet she still whispered, again and again, "I love you, John. Always, always." And John, weeping openly now, repeated through his tears, "I love you too, Mom. I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have done better." But Mary only smiled. "You're my boy. You'll always be my boy. That's enough." The final night. The nurses encouraged John and his family to go home, to rest, but John refused. He stayed by his mother's side through the night, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. Every so often she stirred, whispering prayers, words of love, fragments of memories. Sometimes she called his name, sometimes his father's, sometimes words that made no sense. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the world outside lay still, Mary's breathing grew shallower. The doctor and nurses stood quietly in the room, their presence gentle but solemn. John leaned close, tears running freely. "Mom, it's okay. You can rest now. You've done enough. You've given me everything. I'll never forget you. Never." A single tear slipped from Mary's eye. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. And then, with one last breath, she was gone. A son's guilt. The silence that followed was unbearable. John clutched her hand, now still and cooling, his chest heaving with sobs. Memories crashed through him, her laughter, her sacrifices, her warmth, her endless love. And with them came the crushing realization. He had failed her. She had given him everything. And in her last years, when she needed him most, he had given her so little. It was a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The funeral. A week later, under a gray sky, Mary Evans was laid to rest. A small crowd gathered, neighbors, a few of the Oakwood residents, some distant relatives. John stood by the grave, Susan beside him, Michael holding his hand. The pastor spoke of Mary's kindness, her strength, her selfless love. But John barely heard the words. He was lost in his own grief, staring at the coffin as it lowered into the ground, whispering silently, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Michael looked up at his father, seeing the pain etched into his face. For the first time, the boy began to understand what it meant to lose, to regret, to carry the weight of choices. And though John didn't know it yet, the cycle of neglect and regret was not yet broken. Life, relentless and unkind, would teach him again, this time from the other side. Years passed. The seasons turned again and again, carrying away the sharp edge of John's grief, but leaving behind the dull weight of regret. Mary's absence became part of him, like a scar, always there, always reminding. He thought often of her, sometimes in quiet moments at work, sometimes while watching Michael play, sometimes in dreams that left him waking in tears. At first, he promised himself he would live differently. He told himself he would be more attentive, more present, more loving with his own son. For a while he tried. He went to Michael's school events, taught him how to ride a bike, stayed up late helping with homework. He told himself this was how he could honor his mother, by not repeating his mistakes. But life has a way of pulling people back into its current. Work grew busier, bills piled higher. Susan's health faltered for a time, and John's energy went into caring for her. Michael grew into a teenager, then a young man, his own world expanding, his time for his father shrinking. Slowly, inevitably, the distance grew. The march of time. John aged more quickly than he realized. His hair thinned, turning white, his back stooped. His hands, once steady and strong, began to tremble when he wrote or lifted a cup of tea. By the time he retired, he was already frail. The house that had once been full of life grew quiet, the walls echoing only with memories. Susan passed away not long after, leaving John truly alone for the first time. Michael, now married with children of his own, visited when he could. At first it was weekly, then monthly, then on holidays. "Dad, you know how it is," Michael said once, his voice kind but hurried. "Work's been crazy, and the kids have so many activities. But I'll come more often soon, I promise." John forced a smile. "Of course, son. I understand. I'm proud of you. Don't you worry about me." And as the door closed behind Michael, the words echoed in John's ears, words he had once heard from his own mother. "Don't you worry about me." The loneliness of age. The days blurred together for John. Morning tea, long silences, television shows he barely followed, early nights. Sometimes neighbors dropped by, sometimes an old friend called. But most days he sat in his armchair, staring at the photo of Michael as a boy, grinning, innocent, carefree. He remembered teaching him to fish, holding him after nightmares, cheering at his soccer games. He remembered how much Michael once needed him and how gladly he gave everything. Now, when the phone rang, it was usually a telemarketer. When the doorbell rang, it was the postman. The absence of Michael's presence carved into John's heart like a wound that refused to heal. He told himself Michael loved him. He knew his son was busy, knew life pulled him in 100 directions. But knowing did not erase the loneliness. And in the long, silent hours of night, John began to see his own reflection more clearly. The realization. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, John sat in his armchair with Mary's photograph in his hands, the same photograph he had taken from Oakwood after she passed. Her smile stared back at him, warm, forgiving, eternal. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "Mom, I understand now. I understand what you felt. I understand what I did to you. I left you alone when you needed me most. And now," his voice broke, "now my own son leaves me the same way." He pressed the photo to his chest, his body shaking with sobs. "I should have been there, Mom. I should have sat with you, talked with you, held your hand. And now it's too late. I can't make it right." The truth was cruel but undeniable. Life had brought him full circle. The pain he had caused his mother was now his own pain. The neglect he had justified was now visited upon him. And though Michael loved him, though Michael was not cruel, the result was the same. Loneliness, absence, a love unspoken until it was too late. A lesson. Too late. The next time Michael visited, John tried to speak. "Son," he said, his voice trembling, "do you remember your grandmother? Do you remember how I sent her to Oakwood when she was sick?" Michael frowned. "I remember a little." "I was young," John nodded slowly. "It was the biggest mistake of my life. She needed me, and I wasn't there. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. And now, I feel the same loneliness she must have felt." Michael shifted uncomfortably, not knowing what to say. "Dad, you know I care about you." "I know you do," John said softly. "But caring isn't always the same as being here. Don't make the mistake I made, son. Don't wait until it's too late to give your time, your presence, your love." Michael's eyes dropped, guilt flickering across his face. But before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, sighed, and said, "Dad, I need to take this. We'll talk more next time, all right?" John smiled faintly, nodding. "Of course, son. Don't you worry about me." And as the door closed once more, John leaned back in his chair, whispering into the empty room. History repeats itself. The cycle was complete. A son who neglected his mother grew into a father neglected by his son. And in that bitter mirror, John finally saw the truth too late. Love unexpressed, presence withheld, time postponed. These were wounds that passed from one generation to the next, unless someone chose to break the chain. The night after his visit to his father's house, Michael lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. His wife, Rachel, was already asleep beside him, but Michael's mind refused to rest. His father's words echoed over and over. "Caring isn't always the same as being here. Don't wait until it's too late to give your time, your presence, your love." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to dismiss the conversation, to tell himself that his father was simply being dramatic, that old age made people sentimental. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had neglected his father, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but out of busyness, out of distraction, out of the endless demands of life. Work, bills, soccer practices, piano recitals, dinners, meetings. Everything pulled at him, and his father had become one more responsibility at the bottom of the list. And yet, wasn't this exactly what his father had once done to his own mother? A mirror of the past. Michael remembered faintly the days when his grandmother was alive. He had been only a boy, but certain images lingered. Her thin hands, the soft sound of her voice, the way she smiled at him even when she seemed tired. He remembered visiting her once at Oakwood. The smell of disinfectant, the pale green walls, the hollow silence of the halls. He remembered clinging to his father's hand, asking, "Why can't Grandma come home with us?" His father had replied, "This is the best place for her, son. They'll take care of her here." But the look in his grandmother's eyes, sad, distant, resigned, stayed with Michael even now. And now, his father sat alone in that same silence, in that same loneliness. The mirror was cruel, but it was clear. History was indeed repeating itself. The guilt. Over the next few weeks, Michael found himself restless. At work, he stared blankly at his computer screen, his mind drifting back to his father's frail voice. At home, he watched his children laughing, shouting, running around the house, and he wondered if one day they would forget him too. He began to notice little things, the way his father's hand trembled when lifting a teacup, the way he struggled to open the door, the weariness in his smile. The guilt grew heavier. He realized that his father wasn't asking for much. Not money, not favors, not grand gestures. Just time, just company, just someone to sit with him so he wouldn't feel invisible. And Michael asked himself, if I can give time to colleagues, to clients, to strangers, why can't I give it to the man who raised me? The conversation one Saturday afternoon, Michael told Rachel, "I'm going to see Dad today. Will you come with me?" She looked surprised but smiled warmly. "Of course. I've been thinking we should go more often." They packed the kids into the car and drove across town. When they entered John's house, the old man's eyes lit up brighter than Michael had seen in years. "Michael, Rachel, and the children," John exclaimed, struggling to rise from his chair. His voice trembled with joy. What a surprise! The children ran to hug their grandfather, their laughter filling the room. Rachel went to the kitchen to prepare tea, and Michael, for the first time in years, simply sat beside his father. They talked for hours, about old times, about the children, about small things and big things. John told stories of his youth, of mistakes he had made, of the lessons he wished he had learned sooner. Finally, as evening fell, Michael said quietly, "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About Grandma. About us. You were right. I haven't been here like I should, and I don't want to make the same mistake." John's eyes filled with tears. He reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on his son's. "It's never too late, son. The mistake is not in failing once. The mistake is in not trying again." For the first time in decades, Michael felt a weight lift from his chest. Breaking the cycle. From that day on, Michael made a choice, not a grand, dramatic vow, but a simple one, to be present. He visited his father every week, sometimes with Rachel and the children, sometimes alone. He called in the evenings, even if only for a few minutes. He listened when John spoke, not with half an ear, but with his full attention. The change was small, but to John, it was everything. The loneliness that had haunted his nights slowly faded. The regret that had tormented him softened. He began to smile more, laugh more, live more. And Michael began to see something too, that giving his time to his father wasn't a burden. It was a gift, not just to John, but to himself. For every moment he spent with his father was a moment of love, of memory, of connection that could never be taken away. The cycle was not unbreakable. The past did not have to be repeated forever. And as Michael tucked his children into bed one night, he whispered a silent prayer. "May they learn from me what I have learned from him. May they never have to carry the same regrets." John's story had been one of pain and realization, but Michael's could be different. History could change if someone had the courage to awaken. The years that followed were gentler than John ever expected. For so long he had braced himself for solitude, for the heavy silence of an empty home. But Michael's change of heart had altered everything. Now, laughter often echoed in his house again. The laughter of his grandchildren, of Rachel bustling around the kitchen, of Michael sitting beside him and telling him about work, life, and dreams. The emptiness had not disappeared completely. Susan was gone, Mary was gone. But it was filled, at least in part, with new warmth. John often sat quietly, watching Michael with his children. He saw the patience in his son's eyes, the way he bent down to listen, the way he chose presence over distraction. It was in those moments John realized the curse had been broken. The gift of time. Michael kept his promise, not in grand ways but in small, steady ones. Every Saturday, he came. Sometimes with his family, sometimes alone. Sometimes for hours, sometimes only for a short visit. But always, he came. They played chess together, though John's hands shook too much to move the pieces sometimes, so Michael moved them for him. They read books together, Michael reading aloud when John's eyesight weakened. They walked slowly in the park, leaning on each other, the past and present blending in quiet companionship. "Do you know something, Dad?" Michael said one evening as they sat watching the sunset from John's porch. "When I was younger, I used to think you were invincible, that nothing could ever slow you down." John chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. "I used to think the same about myself. And now," Michael hesitated, "now I realize you're not invincible. You're human." "And I should have seen that sooner." John reached over, gripping his son's hand. "Better late than never, son. Far better late than never, healing old wounds." But even in these peaceful years, John carried regret like a shadow. His thoughts often returned to his mother, Mary, whose final days had been so lonely. One afternoon, as Michael helped him sort through an old chest of belongings, John found the photograph again. Mary's smile, frozen in time, looked up at him. He held it for a long time, tears brimming. "She forgave me, you know," he whispered, "even when I didn't deserve it. I only hope I've made peace with her in some way." Michael put a hand on his father's shoulder. "You have, Dad. By teaching me, by showing me the mistake so I wouldn't repeat it. You honored her by changing." For the first time, John believed it. The guilt didn't vanish, but it softened. It no longer chained him. It guided him. His mother's absence had taught him the hardest lesson, and now he had passed it on to his son. The final days. As the years drew on, John's health declined. His legs weakened, his heart grew frail, and simple tasks became difficult. But through it all, Michael remained by his side. Hospitals, doctor's appointments, long nights. Michael was there. He never once spoke of being too busy, never once turned away. His children helped too, bringing joy to their grandfather's fading days. One evening, as John lay in bed too weak to rise, he called Michael close. "Son," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear, "I want to tell you something before I go." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "Don't talk like that, Dad." John smiled faintly. "It's the truth, son. And I've learned not to fear the truth. Listen to me. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me time. Your presence healed wounds I thought would never close. You broke the cycle." Michael's tears slipped down his cheeks as he squeezed his father's hand. "I only wish I had understood sooner." John shook his head. "No, Michael. Sooner or later doesn't matter. What matters is you understood before it was too late. You gave me peace." His voice faltered, but his smile remained. "And now, I can go knowing that when your children look at you, they will never feel what I felt as a boy, or what I gave my mother in her final days. You've changed everything." Michael bowed his head against his father's hand, sobbing quietly. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, son." Those were John's final words. Chakra. When John passed away, he did so not in loneliness, but surrounded by the people he loved. His son was there, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, all gathered, holding his hands, speaking words of love he had once thought would never come. And though grief struck Michael deeply, there was also peace. For he knew his father had left the world not in regret, but in redemption. At the funeral, Michael spoke softly to his children. "Your great-grandmother, my grandmother, she spent her last days alone because of me and your grandfather's mistake. But your grandfather taught me that love is not about words, it's about presence, it's about being there. Don't forget that. Never leave love unspoken, never leave time ungiven. because one day it will be too late." His children nodded, their young eyes wide, the weight of his words settling into their hearts. And so, John's story did not end with regret. It ended with peace, a peace that came not from perfection, but from forgiveness, change, and the courage to love while there was still time. Michael poured himself into his family with a new awareness. He didn't just provide. He was there. He was at soccer games, piano recitals, school plays. He tucked his children into bed, told them stories, listened to their worries. One evening, after a long day, his son Daniel asked, "Dad, why do you always come to my games, even when you're tired?" Michael smiled gently. "Because being there matters more than anything. You'll understand one day when you're older." And though Daniel didn't fully grasp the meaning, he felt it. The warmth of a father's presence, the assurance that he mattered, passing down the lesson. As the years went on, Michael shared the story of his grandmother and his father with his children, not in bitterness, but as a lesson. He told them how his father had once made a mistake, how regret had haunted him, and how love in the end had redeemed him. "Life goes fast," Michael told them one night as they sat around the dinner table. "You think you'll always have time, but you don't. Don't wait to say what needs to be said. Don't wait to give your time to the people you love. Time is the greatest gift you can give." His children listened in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. And as they grew older, they remembered. The circle transformed. When Michael himself grew older, his children did not forget him. They visited, they called, they sat with him. They did not treat him as a burden, but as a blessing, a man whose love had shaped them. Michael never faced the loneliness his father had endured. Instead, he was surrounded by presence, by laughter, by conversation, by warmth. In those moments, he realized the truth. His father's suffering had not been in vain. It had been the seed that grew into change, into a new way of loving. The cycle of neglect had been broken. The circle had been transformed, from regret into redemption, from absence into presence, from silence into love. The legacy lives on. On Michael's final day, long after his hair had turned white and his hands had grown frail, he sat with his children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. He smiled at them, his voice weak but steady. "If you remember one thing about me, let it be this. I learned the hard way that time is precious. Never think you'll always have tomorrow. Love today. Be there today. That is the greatest legacy you can leave behind." Tears fell from the eyes of his family, but their hearts were strong, filled with the love he had given them. And when Michael closed his eyes for the last time, he did so in peace, knowing that his father's story, his grandmother's story, and his own story had all woven together into something greater, a legacy not of regret, but of love. Epilogue. Years later, one of Michael's grandchildren, grown now with children of her own, wrote in her journal, "My great-grandmother was left alone in her final days. My grandfather carried that regret his whole life, but my father changed everything. He showed us that love means presence, and because of him, we will never forget. We will carry this lesson forward so that no one in our family ever feels forgotten again."